My life began with a shadow, a bittersweet whisper of a past I could never truly touch. My father, David, told me the story countless times, his voice always hushed, filled with a quiet sadness that deepened the lines around his eyes. My mother, Maria, a beautiful, vibrant woman with a laugh that could fill a room, had died from complications just hours after I was born. I was her last breath, her final act of love, a precious, painful legacy. Her photograph, framed on my bedside table, showed a young woman with a radiant smile and eyes that seemed to hold endless warmth. She was a ghost, a silent guardian, a constant reminder of what I had lost, and what she had sacrificed. Her death was the defining tragedy of our small family, the reason for my father's stoicism, the explanation for the pervasive quietness in our home. Dad raised me alone, a man forged in the crucible of loss. He was hardworking, meticulous, and intensely protective. He loved me, I knew, but his love was often expressed through provision and protection, less so through open affection or tender words. He worked long, grueling hours at the local factory, ensuring I had everything I needed, from new clothes to school supplies, but our home always felt tinged with an unspoken grief, a void that could never be filled. I was an only child, and often felt the weight of that immense loss, the absence of a mother's soft touch, a feminine presence in our quiet house. I was her legacy, her precious gift, and I carried that burden with a quiet reverence, a sense of being perpetually indebted to her memory, to her ultimate sacrifice. My relationship with my father was a complex tapestry of gratitude and longing. He was my rock, the only parent I knew, yet there was a deep, unplumbable well of sadness in him that I could never quite reach, a part of him that remained perpetually out of bounds. He rarely spoke of my mother, Maria. If I asked, his answers were clipped, his gaze distant, his jaw tight. It was a very difficult time, darling, he'd say, his voice strained, almost brittle. She was very ill. The birth was complicated. He'd always emphasized the danger of childbirth, the fragility of life, the immense sacrifice involved. I learned quickly not to probe, respecting his pain, believing it was too raw, too sacred to touch. I thought his silence was profound grief. I didn't realize then that his silence was a carefully guarded shield, protecting not just his sorrow, but a far more devastating, insidious secret that had shaped every corner of my existence. There were other family members, of course. My father's sister, Aunt Carol, a warm, boisterous woman who lived a few towns over. She was a whirlwind of energy whenever she visited, bringing homemade cookies and a much-needed burst of laughter into our often somber home. She'd hug me tight, almost too tight sometimes, her embrace clinging, her eyes welling up as she looked at me, a strange, unspoken sadness in her gaze that mirrored my father's, but seemed to hold a different, sharper edge. She'd often tell me how much I looked like my mother, how I had her eyes, her smile, her spirit. I thought it was simply empathy, her own grief for her lost sister-in-law, a shared understanding of our collective sorrow. I didn't realize then that her sympathy was a cruel illusion, and her quiet empathy was a burden of complicity, her heart holding a terrible knowledge that she dared not speak. Looking back, the cracks in the narrative, in the carefully constructed facade of my life, were subtle at first, almost imperceptible to my trusting, innocent heart. My father had a small, intricately carved wooden box in his study, a place he never let me touch. It sat on his desk, almost like a shrine, and he often stared at it, his face etched with a strange mixture of regret, fear, and a deep, unreadable bitterness. He said it contained important papers, documents too precious for prying eyes, remnants of his past life with Maria. Sometimes, I'd see him looking at it, his hand hovering over the lid, a profound sadness settling over him. I attributed it to his private nature, to the sacredness of his grief, nothing more. Then there were the anniversaries. My birthday, specifically, was always a day shrouded in a unique blend of muted celebration and palpable sadness. It was, after all, the date of my mother's supposed death. Dad would always grow more withdrawn, spending the day in quiet contemplation, a distant look in his eyes. He'd bring me a small gift, a modest cake, and then retreat into his study, emerging only to lay a fresh bouquet of white lilies by Maria's photograph. There was never a shared acknowledgement of grief, never a conversation about her, about our memories of her. Just a quiet, heavy silence that spoke volumes of his profound, private sorrow. I thought it was his way of coping, his deep, unwavering love for her, his raw, unyielding pain. I didn't realize then that these were not just cracks, but gaping chasms, hinting at a truth far more profound, far more horrifying, than I could comprehend. A persistent peculiarity was the frustrating lack of details about my mother's illness, about the specific circumstances of her death. I knew she died in childbirth, a phrase uttered with a solemn finality. But any attempt to learn more, hospital names, doctors' names, specific complications, any medical history, was met with a vague wave of the hand, a dismissive sigh, or a quick, almost panicked change of subject. "It was a long time ago, honey," he'd always say, his voice tight with forced patience. "Best not to dwell. It was very tragic. Very sudden." His explanations always felt a little too vague, his eyes a little too evasive, his body language stiffening whenever I pressed. I always rationalized it as his way of protecting me, shielding me from the brutal details of loss, from the trauma of her passing. The most unsettling crack, though, was my own recurring dream. It was a vivid, fragmented dream that haunted my sleep, leaving me with an ache in my chest that lingered long after I woke. It was a dream of a woman's face, not the one in the photograph on my bedside table, not the Maria of my father's tragic story. It was a different face, with warm, searching eyes, a gentle smile that promised comfort. She would be holding me, her touch soft, her scent familiar, a faint aroma of lavender and something earthy, like fresh paint. She would whisper words I couldn't quite grasp, blurred by the edges of sleep, but the feeling she imparted was one of profound love and yearning. I'd wake up with a tear-stained face, a profound sense of loss that felt distinct from my structured grief for, dead, Elena. I tried to rationalize it as just a dream, a child's unconscious longing for a mother, a phantom embrace born of my lonely imagination. I didn't realize then that this dream was a distant echo of a suppressed memory, a fragment of the truth buried deep within my subconscious, a desperate attempt by my buried self to break through the layers of deceit. As I grew older, my fascination with my mother's death deepened, evolving into a quiet, almost scholarly obsession. I yearned to know more about her, about the circumstances of my birth, about the woman who had sacrificed everything for me. My father's continued evasiveness, his almost panicked refusal to discuss it, only fueled my quiet obsession, feeding the persistent, nagging feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with the story I had been told. I started researching on my own, digging through dusty old newspaper archives, poring over microfiche at the local library, looking for any obituaries from that time, any mention of Maria's passing. Nothing. No record of Elena's death matching the date my father always gave me, no hospital records, no doctor's reports. I always found it puzzling, attributed it to poor record-keeping in our small town, or my own incompetence as a budding amateur detective. But the void, the lack of official documentation, left a gaping hole in the narrative. I didn't realize then that my entire life was a meticulously constructed deception, and my father, the man I loved, was somehow at the heart of it, a silent architect of my greatest lie. The climax arrived not with a bang, not with a dramatic revelation, but with a quiet, sickening click of my computer mouse, a mundane action that shattered my entire existence. It was my 23rd birthday. The familiar ritual of muted celebration had passed, and my father, true to form, had retreated into his study, leaving me alone with the melancholic anniversary of my supposed origin. Exhausted by the familiar ritual of quiet grief, of living a half-life of sorrow for a woman I never knew, I decided to finally face the locked wooden box on his desk. He rarely left it unlocked, but today, perhaps in his grief-induced distraction, perhaps in a moment of unconscious yearning for the truth to be found, he had. The lid was slightly ajar. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside, it wasn't old financial papers, as he'd claimed, or sacred mementos of Maria. It was filled with letters. Dozens of them. All addressed to my father, David. And they were signed. Elena. My mother. Not Maria, as I'd always known her, but Elena. The name from my dreams, the name I didn't recognize on my birth certificate research. But the dates on the letters were recent. Very recent. Some were just a few months old. My heart began to pound, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. My breath hitched. My blood ran cold. The first few lines of the top letter, dated just last year, sent a jolt of icy terror through my entire being, searing its way into my soul. David, I know it's my fault. I know I left. I know I made a terrible mistake. But please, tell her the truth. She deserves to know. She's 23 now, David. She's an adult. I miss her every single day. I see her pictures, growing up from the ones Carol sends, and it tears my heart out. Please, just one visit. Just one phone call. Don't punish her for my mistakes. Don't make her live a lie. I'm waiting. Always. My mind reeled, a whirlwind of disbelief and dawning horror. I know I left. I miss her every day. She deserves to know. Elena. My mother. She hadn't died giving birth to me. She was alive. She had left. She had left. And my father. He had known. He had perpetuated the lie for 23 years, letting me believe she was dead, letting me mourn a ghost, letting me carry the burden of her supposed sacrifice, all while she was out there, living, yearning, missing me. The letters continued, a heartbreaking, agonizing chronicle of a woman desperate to connect with the child she had left behind. They spoke of a secret past, a desperate decision, a life she had chosen outside of our family, away from the perceived suffocations of a conventional marriage. They spoke of regret, of yearning, of a plea for forgiveness and reconnection. And they were all addressed to my father, who had clearly received them, read them, absorbed their contents, and then meticulously hidden them away, his bitterness a formidable wall against the truth. The world went silent, then exploded into a million shattering pieces. It was like a sudden, brutal awakening, a blinding flash of lightning that illuminated the darkest, most horrifying corners of my life. My mother. Alive. Not a tragic memory. But a woman who had walked away. My father. Not a grieving widower. But a man who had lied to me my entire life, stealing my truth, denying me a mother, even a flawed one, out of bitterness, out of a misguided, selfish attempt to protect his own wounded pride, his own carefully constructed narrative. The emotional chaos was instant, overwhelming. Heartbreak for the shattered illusion of my childhood, for the beautiful, poignant story of sacrifice that had defined my early years. It was a searing, guttural pain that twisted inside me, making it hard to breathe. Anger at my father, a hot, venomous rage that pulsed through my veins, consuming me, for his calculated deception, his profound betrayal, the way he had sacrificed my truth for his secret. Shame, for being so blind, so naive, so utterly fooled by the man I loved and revered, the man who was supposed to be my protector, my guide. And silence. A deafening, echoing silence in his study, in our sacred home, a silence that magnified the screams in my head, the crashing sounds of my world falling apart. My life. My identity. My grief. All of it, obliterated in a single, devastating moment. The man who was supposed to protect me, who was supposed to be my only parent, had woven an elaborate lie, keeping me from my mother, and her from me. He hadn't just mourned a wife, he had deliberately, cruelly, buried a living truth. I looked at the letters again, focusing on the return addresses. They were all from a small town several states away. A faint, almost imperceptible scent clung to them, lavender and something earthy, like fresh paint. My recurring dream, the woman's face, the gentle touch, the familiar scent, it all coalesced into a chilling, horrifying reality. My mother hadn't died. She had simply disappeared. And my father had helped her disappear, not from life, but from my life. And that's when I realized, they never loved me the way I loved them. What came after was a raw, visceral struggle for survival, a desperate fight to reclaim my truth, my identity, my very self from the wreckage of their lies. I didn't want revenge that would just burn everything down, I wanted truth, understanding, and a chance to truly begin my life. I needed peace, and peace wouldn't come from silence or passive acceptance. I sat there in the study, frozen, clutching the letters, the words blurring through my tears. My father would be home soon. I had to choose, protect his secret, remain complicit in the lie that had defined my entire life, or expose the truth, no matter the cost. The initial shock gave way to a cold, hard fury, a burning need for light in the crushing darkness. There was no going back. The truth had to come out. I meticulously gathered the letters, stuffing them back into the box, but taking careful note of the return address on the most recent one. My mind raced, forming a plan, a desperate need for answers, for connection, for justice, overriding everything else. The first, and most agonizing, step was confronting my father. He walked in a few hours later, his face tired but relaxed from his golf game, carrying a small box of donuts for my birthday. He looked at me, sitting in his study, the open box of letters on the table, and his eyes widened. The color drained from his face, his relaxed demeanor replaced by an immediate, stark terror. The box of donuts slipped from his grasp, scattering across the floor. What is this?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper, his gaze fixed on the letters. "These are from Mom," I said, my voice dangerously calm, devoid of emotion, a chilling contrast to the tempest raging inside me. "Elena. She didn't die, Dad. She left. And you lied to me. For 23 years. You let me believe my birth killed her. You let me mourn a ghost." He collapsed into his desk chair, covering his face with his hands, his body shaking with silent sobs. The confession, when it came, was a broken, halting narrative of a man consumed by bitterness, by wounded pride, and by a misguided, selfish attempt to protect his child from a painful truth. He told me Elena had left him, not because of me, but because she felt stifled, trapped by the expectations of marriage and conventional life. She was an artist, a free spirit, and our quiet, predictable life felt like a cage to her. She had left him for another life, another city, another chance at happiness, at self-expression. He was heartbroken, humiliated, and filled with a burning, all-consuming resentment. In his rage and despair, he decided to tell everyone she had died in childbirth, a more palatable, tragic narrative than the brutal, shaming truth of abandonment. He wanted to punish her, to erase her from my life as she had erased herself from his. The letters were her desperate attempts to reconnect, pleas he had systematically ignored, hiding them away, fueling his bitterness, building a wall of silence between us and her. "I thought I was doing what was best for you, honey," he choked out, his voice raw with grief and regret. "I wanted to protect you from the pain of abandonment. I didn't want you to think your mother didn't love you." His words rang hollow. His protection was a cruel deception, a deliberate act of emotional theft. He had denied me the truth, denied me a chance to know my mother, even a flawed one. He had stolen my identity, my birth story, and replaced it with a lie, a fabricated tragedy that had haunted my entire life. The second limb was severed. The trust with my father, once unbreakable, shattered into a million pieces. The image of the stoic, grieving widower was irrevocably shattered, replaced by the bitter, controlling man who had stolen my truth, my history, my very sense of self. My next step was to find my mother. Armed with the address from the letters, I booked a flight, a pilgrimage into the unknown, a desperate search for the missing piece of my soul. I traveled to that small, distant town, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and wild hope. I found her in a small art gallery, her hands stained with paint, her eyes holding that familiar, wistful sadness from my dreams, but also a spark of vibrant life. She was older, of course, with lines of experience etched around her eyes, but undeniably the woman from my dreams, the woman from the photographs. "Elena?" I asked, my voice trembling, a fragile bridge over 23 years of silence. My name. You're my daughter." Her reaction was a stunned, silent gasp, followed by a torrent of tears. She confirmed everything. She had left, yes, driven by a desperate need for freedom, a misguided belief that she wasn't cut out for conventional motherhood, or for the quiet life my father offered. She had regretted it almost immediately, had tried to connect, sending letters, trying to make amends, but my father had always blocked her, his bitterness a formidable, impenetrable wall. She had lived a life haunted by my absence, yearning for the child she had left behind, carrying the weight of her choice and his unforgiveness. The reunion was raw, messy, and intensely emotional. Years of pain, regret, and longing poured out. We talked for hours, for days, for weeks, trying to bridge the 23-year chasm of silence and lies. She was a flawed woman, yes, a woman who had made an incredibly difficult and selfish choice. But she was also my mother, alive and breathing, and desperately wanting to know me, to reconnect, to share her life. We explored her art, her passions, and in connecting with her, I found a part of myself I never knew was missing, an understanding of my own creative impulses, my own longing for freedom and self-expression. My revenge wasn't about vindictiveness, it was about truth and reclamation. It was about ensuring my father faced the consequences of his deception, and that I finally had the chance to know my mother, to integrate her into my life. I didn't expose him publicly in a sensational way, not for gossip or tabloid headlines. But I calmly and firmly ensured that he understood the profound, irreparable damage he had done to our relationship. I told Aunt Carol, his sister, the full truth, knowing that the family would eventually know, and that the narrative he had so carefully constructed would finally crumble. The news rippled through our small community, and his reputation, once that of a grieving widower, shifted to that of a man who had perpetrated a cruel, decades-long deception. His quiet world became much smaller, haunted by the truth he had tried to bury. My relationship with my father became irrevocably broken. I loved him, perhaps, in some distant, filial way, for the years he had raised me, but the trust was gone. The image of the stoic, grieving father was shattered, replaced by the bitter, controlling man who had stolen my truth, my history, my very sense of self. I maintained contact, but the intimacy was gone, replaced by a polite, cautious distance, a chasm that could never be fully bridged. My relationship with Elena, my biological mother, was a journey of tentative rediscovery, a blossoming into a new kind of family. It was complicated, filled with joy and grief, new laughter and old tears. She was learning to be a mother, openly, for the first time, and I was learning to be her child, unburdened by secrets. We built a new kind of relationship, based on honesty, vulnerability, and a fierce, protective love that bloomed from the ashes of betrayal. She finally got to claim me, openly and proudly, and I finally got to know my true mother. I didn't want revenge. I needed peace. And that peace began to bloom when I accepted that my story wasn't about their failures, but about my resilience. It was about standing up for the truth, about finding my own way, about proving that I could emerge from the wreckage stronger, wiser, and infinitely more whole. I learned that sometimes, the greatest betrayals lead to the most profound discoveries about yourself, about forgiveness, and about the true meaning of family. My journey to truth was painful, but it led me to a profound understanding of who I am, and who truly protects my heart. I thought losing them would destroy me, but it made me who I am. Family isn't who shares your blood, it's who protects your heart.